Dallas Theological Seminary's Chapel Podcast.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's been great to be with you this week. It's my privilege to introduce to you our speaker today, Cindy Wiles. She's going to be speaking on local church partnerships, and she's really positioned well because of her experience, to share with you this morning. She and her husband, Dennis, lead the ministry at one of the great churches here in the Metroplex, First Baptist Arlington. They've been there for the last 11 years. Before that, they were in Huntsville, Alabama. They've been involved in ministry for 30 years. Cindy is the executive director of a group called Kinexxus, and it's a group of local churches all around the United States that are doing ministry together. So I know she's going to be sharing out of that experience today. So she is a Southwestern grad. This is her first time to be on the campus of Dallas Seminary. So let's give her a warm welcome. Cindy Wiles.
Well, good morning. I have a tendency not to be bothered by numbers when I consider that Jesus was content to begin with 12, and so it never has affected me when the room has a few empty seats. So I think that the ones that God chose to be here today are here, and we'll enjoy this time together. I want to thank Dr. Strauss for the invitation to be here and to spend this time with you. I am a little embarrassed to say that I've lived in Arlington now for 11 years, and this is the first time I've wandered onto the DTS campus and had to even ask directions to get to the chapel. But I'm really grateful for this time with you. Appreciate Dr. Brewer and the leadership that he provides for not only DTS students and East West Ministries, but for many works around the world. And I also learned this week who really makes the world go around here, and that's Roseanne Hopwood, and I appreciate all of her efforts in bringing this together this week. I hope you've had a great week, and I hope that you've experienced some new thoughts, perhaps some opportunities to hear some new perspective. My assumptions that I make when I'm walking into this room is that I'm looking at a room full of leaders, of people who are likely going to be in leadership in the local church context, or in an organizational context, an institutional context, or in a missions context, and most likely that is who you are. I love this particular topic that I've been assigned. You always love it when you get an assignment that you really like. This one is on church partnership and doing missions together, which happens to be my heartbeat. Outside of sitting here and reflecting on the beauty of the Godhead or my two amazing grandsons, I can't think of anything I'd rather speak about than church partnerships. It's what I do. I think my PowerPoint's up there, you'll see the logo of the church network that I'm involved with, which is called Kinexxus. Strange name, too many X's, nobody can spell it, but the name is very intentional. There's a lot in the name of our of intentionality in the name of this network. Kinexxus contains several ideas: connection, nexus, that coming together, that meeting place. Kin, we're kind of related to each other. Us, we're together. And right in the center of that, you see a red dot, which is actually a red moon that we selected to remind us of the Kairos in which we live. So today, perhaps at the brown bag, I'll have a little more time to share about Kinexxus specifically if there's time for that, or I'll hang around for any questions that you might have. But I really want to talk more today about our perspective. This is not really a discussion today about methodology as much as it is one of observation of a reality. I think one of the challenges for us that we all face is we're birthed. You're birthed as a leader into a particular point in history and time, and you have a certain responsibility to evaluate that time. I remember several years ago when this came home to me personally, I had two particular people in my life who kept asking me the question, "What time is it?" And one of them happened to be a spiritual mentor. He was my Sunday school teacher. And I said, I have the feeling that you're not asking me about whether it's 10 minutes till 9. I think that you are asking me a more serious question. And as we began that conversation, I said, I do hope that when I consider the question about what time it is, I'm like a man of Issachar, that I'm a person who understands my time and knows what to do. And that is the challenge, as it was for David's mighty men, to understand our time and to know what to do. But as we understand our time, one of the things that we must do is to consider what's going on in the world around us, but more importantly, what Kairos do we live in? And how do we take the chronology and the chronos of our daily life and place it underneath the authority and the design of a much bigger picture? So in that light, let's imagine ourselves right now. Let's imagine God's divine story, what you would call the meta-narrative or the big story. Let's imagine that as a drama. And if so, what would we name it? I am a romantic, and I would probably call it the divine love story. You might call it the meta-narrative. If you're going overseas and you've been studying, you might call it one story. We might pick other names for it, the Missio Dei. But it would be a story about God, and it would be about God's glory and God's revelation of himself and God's redemptive story of bringing mankind into a restored relationship with him as a God of relationship. And so we would be a part, in a sense, we would be players, actors on this stage. Unfortunately for many, whether it's individuals, institutions, or organizations, many times we make the mistake of thinking that the play is about us. and we get so involved in our own chronos and our own chronology, what we're going to do, what we're going to plan, where we're going to go, how we're going to organize it. And we get so involved in our own story that we fail to look at the backdrop to see what God is doing and what God is about in this era. And so that's our challenge. We know several things about this drama that are very specific to us in Scripture. I'm going to refer to Acts chapter 2, a passage that's very familiar to you. When Peter tries to help us get a grip, he tries to help us define our Kairos. In Acts chapter 2, verse 14, he begins, as the Spirit of God has been poured out at Pentecost upon the disciples, and they are proclaiming and preaching in languages that that everyone can understand, that no one can speak, but everyone can understand. Then Peter stood up with the 11 and raised his voice and addressed the crowd. Fellow Jews, and all of you who are in Jerusalem, let me explain this to you. Listen carefully to what I say. These men are not drunk, as you suppose. It's only 9 a.m. I always found that interesting. No, this is what is spoken of by the prophet Joel. Okay, let's stop for just a minute. He didn't say, this is what Joel says is going to happen in the future. He didn't say, anticipate this coming later. He said, this is. Here's where we are. And he goes on to explain, in these last days. Okay, so let's pause there for a minute. In these last days, if we were describing this story as a drama, we might say we are in the final act. In these last days, God says, I will pour out my Spirit on all people. Your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my Spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. I will show them wonders in the heaven above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord. And then say this with me, and everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So if we're wondering what act we're in this divine love story, Peter has made that very, very clear for us. Now, it's important that we understand the backdrop, and this is where I found myself around the turn of this century. I've been in pastoral ministry for over 20 years, my husband and I in the local church context, but began to have this struggle because I felt like God was saying something to me. I felt like what he was saying to me as a leader in a local church context was that I was failing to allow myself to imagine. And that which I was failing to imagine was what Jesus was imagining when he spoke the words, "On this rock I'll build my church." Now, the Word of God in flesh, who was the creative force of the universe, said, "On this rock I'm going to build my church." Now, what was Jesus imagining when he said those words? What did Jesus have in mind when he spoke those words? If I fail to try to imagine what he was imagining, then I need to be in a vocation besides ministry in a local church context. I need to find something else to do because Jesus has called us as leaders in the local church to try to get our mind around what he imagined so that we can be a part in leading others to understand what he hopes to accomplish. By around 2005, I found myself, and Dennis, my husband, and I found ourselves in an intense dialogue with missions leaders and pastors who were kind of in a similar place. We like to describe it this way, that our ecclesiology and our missiology collided in a big train wreck. And there was a huge collision where we began to ask ourselves, what is the church supposed to be doing? I'd like to say this was just a really joyful and an exciting time, but the truth was it was a very difficult time because the questions that we were asking about God's mission and the way to live out God's mission in this century were putting us very much at odds with our own denomination. We were swimming upstream against the tide of our denomination. And so we were in a very uncomfortable place. What do you do when you're uncomfortable? You go to a doctor, right? So we took the summer of 2007 and we went to hang out with some friends at the U.S. Center for World Mission on the campus of William Carey University in Pasadena, California. We were blessed to be there in the autumn, entering into the winter of Dr. Ralph Winter's life. How many of you are familiar with Dr. Ralph Winter? I'm sure that if you've gone through Perspectives, you've read his very well-known presentation to Asians, an article called Two Structures of God's Redemptive Mission, where he describes the church and churches and denominations as a modality who are very much dependent upon the agency or something beyond the church as a sodality in order to effectively accomplish the mission's task. And so I'm not sure what motivated me to think that I was going to get any sympathy from Ralph Winter when I went to the U.S. Center for World Mission that summer. It was a great time of thinking and dialoguing and a great time to be with him, as I said, in this final years of his life. But I remember my first introduction to Ralph Winter when someone was introducing us and explaining to him that we were people who were there because we felt drawn to this concept of churches partnering with churches, of a reclamation of church-based sending in the context of the local church, and I could tell he was listening and carefully analyzing everything that had just been said, and he responded by saying this bluntly: "I've never seen or heard of a church-based mission ministry that was ever successful." And then he walked away, and I thought, this is going to be a really long month. This is going to, yeah. But it turned out to be a wonderful time. But the problem was, we were not living at the U.S. Center for World Mission. We were living in a place where our finger was on the pulse of the local church. And we believed with all of our hearts that the church was being inverted, turned inside out, in a way in the 21st century that was unprecedented in any other point in history. And so we had to examine the backdrop, which you have to also do. You've got to examine that backdrop that you are emerging into leadership during that time. And so you've got to consider and ask some important questions. Let's talk a little bit about the backdrop of your era of ministry. You are coming into ministry at a time when where globalization is the name of the game. Now, sometimes when we talk about globalization, we only talk about it from economic perspective, but what the word globalization really means is to extend to all parts of the world, to all parts of the globe, and whether that's an economic term or whether that's used to describe anything that is reaching an extension, that is pushing outward. You live in a time of globalization. I remember the day that this really came home to visit me, and it was a strong point of conviction for me. I was sitting in a Sunday school class in my local church, and one of my class members was there. His name is Dwayne. Dwayne is a very young, very handsome, very smart young businessman and entrepreneur. That morning when he came into class, he had just returned from China, and he was discussing with us a dilemma that he encountered while he was there. See, Dwayne is an inventor. He invented a halogen light bulb, and he pulled out of the manufacturing business he was a part of, formed his own business, and began developing and manufacturing this particular light bulb. It was a business that exploded. He had a base office here in the Metroplex, and by the time he joined my class, he had over 500 employees in China and 500 employees in Taiwan. Very young and successful man. And so that morning he came to Sunday school and he said to me, as I was sitting at the table with business leaders in China last week, I was trying to figure out how I'm supposed to share my faith. And he began to describe all of these ways that he was trying to interject his faith into a conversation of colleagues, of people like him, a place where he had a seat at the table. And at that moment, a huge sense of conviction came over me. And I thought, how arrogant am I? Dwayne's smart enough to invent a halogen light bulb. Dwayne is smart enough to develop a business. He's smart enough to set up manufacturing businesses in 2 Asian countries. He's smart enough to manage 1,000 employees. But I think he's not smart enough to understand good mission strategy. How arrogant am I? And it was a point of conviction where I and my husband began to ask ourselves, how do we prepare the Dwaynes of our world, the Dwaynes of our local body, to take the message of Christ into absolutely every arena they penetrate? Dwayne was a type, but my church is filled with types. All kinds of types. People moving here, people with influence there, people on business. I had another woman come to me and say, I'd love to go with you on that trip to Indonesia, but to go with you on mission, but right now my job requires me to go to Indonesia a week every month. And she didn't see herself as a missionary. And I began to feel very guilty about the way I had participated in the crippling of the local body. Not just mine, but denominationally for me, the way we had arranged a system where we had elevated the missionary to a professional level, and we had said to our congregation, this is not for you. And it was a huge point of conviction for me that changed everything that we were about. Globalization. Your world is inverted. Your church is inverted. Everybody in it is going out. They're going out and they're penetrating the world in all kinds of ways. And our responsibility as leaders is to ask, how do we equip our people as they go to be able to share a contextual message of Christ in any arena where they have influence? Another part of your backdrop, another characteristic of your backdrop is connectivity. You can't imagine if you're under age 30, maybe 35, what the world was like for the rest of us. I can remember I used to be fascinated even by prayer, that God could hear my thoughts. And it was a point of faith struggle for me many times. There's no way God could actually hear your thoughts if you didn't say them out loud. I remember struggling that with a child, and now as I set my phone next to another phone and cloned them, I'm thinking, it doesn't seem quite as mysterious as it once did. We live in a great age of connectivity where people who have a common affinity can be connected, where churches who have a common affinity can be connected. After the tsunami, the great tsunami that hit Indonesia several years ago, there was a church from Frisco here in the Metroplex who felt compelled to respond to what had happened in that devastating tsunami. They go there. They begin to set up some structures in order to work there. They ask the city of Frisco to become a partner city with the city of Aceh, and they go there and they begin some work. When they got there, they realized they weren't alone. But there were a lot of other churches that were there. Some of them had been there prior to the tsunami. All of these were U.S. churches running short-term teams into the area of Aceh. As they begin to get there and they begin to make these connections, what they realized was that there were 16 churches in the U.S. that were called to work among the Achenese people. And so they made an intentional effort to join the efforts of these churches. And yes, they coordinated their efforts in the tsunami, but once the tsunami recovery was over, they had formed an affinity network focused on the city of Aceh, one of the most strongly Islamic and closed countries in the entire world. They had formed a network and are now supporting workers into that area, strategizing together, conference calling together, sharing resources, sharing funding, sharing personnel, sharing ideas. And together, they are involved right now in a huge church planting effort among the Achenese. That is what is available to us because of connectivity. Another part, a characteristic of your backdrop as you enter ministry is that of collaboration. Now, collaboration is a kind of a buzzword. We hear it, it's the world's word in many ways to talk about collaboration. And I think what we mean by that is we talk about people or entities or organizations coming in and doing what they do best. And as we each come in and do what we do best and join our efforts collaboratively, that each of us can accomplish something together that is far greater than any one of us could do alone. This is an age of collaborations where churches share not only the individual giftings of their people or the cooperative access of their resources, but it's also an age where we can ask the question, what is the corporate gift that my church brings to the table? Churches have corporate giftings in the same way that individuals within churches have spiritual giftings. Churches have corporate giftings. I can look at, now after 30 years of Christian ministry in the local church context, I can look at any given church and I could describe for you the personality and the corporate giftings of that church. What's really beautiful in this age is when we recognize our church's corporate giftings and we bring that gifting to the table. I've seen that play out beautifully for my own church in a recent collaborative effort, a very large collaborative effort it is an effort where churches and state universities and Christian universities and orphan care organizations have all mingled together into a large collaborative endeavor in West Africa. And in this effort, we had to ask the question, what does our church bring to the table? Well, what our church brought to the table was a can-do spirit, the kind of spirit that says, you know what, if it hasn't been done, we'll do it. If no one's ever done it before, we'll be the first. If somebody's got to go out there and pave the path, then we will be the church that does that. It's a certain spirit that my church possesses. And so who were the first ones on the ground? Who were the first ones to establish an NGO? It was one church. And because of that, many churches have been able to come in and to utilize what one church offered to a larger collaborative effort. Another thing that's very characteristic of our age and that we've got to deal with, and I think it's an issue that maybe we've been in denial about it as Americans, and we're just now beginning to understand the potential as we awaken to the reality of people group migration. God has brought the world to the churches. You know, when Christ sent us out and commissioned us and said, go to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the uttermost, and knowing and telling his disciples the end wouldn't come until the gospel had been preached to all nations. I think that God has chosen to help us out in our obedience by bringing the peoples of the world to us. I was on the website of a New York-based ministry called Global Gates. If you're not familiar with that ministry, you need to check it out. It's run by a young leader named Chris Clayman, who's the author of a book called Ethnicities. It's a wonderful book about the unreached peoples of New York. And so if you go to that website, you'll see several things. But one of the statements on this website says, if the members of the unreached people groups living in New York Metro were collectively counted as a city, they would form the second largest city in the United States. Is that baffling? That if you just took the UPGs, the unreached peoples of Metro New York, and collected them together, they would form a city that would be the second largest city in America. It also says on that website that Queens, New York is the most ethnically diverse county in the United States, that half of the people who reside in Queens, New York were born in another country. I found that just staggering. God has brought the world to the churches. What would it look like for the churches of a local community, rather than competing with one another, to strategize together and cooperate in a way that guarantees that every person in every UPG in the sphere of our community has a contextualized access to the gospel? What would that look like? I think that right now we're being asked to take advantage of this opportunity that God has provided to us by bringing the peoples of the world into our neighborhood, just across the street or on our doorstep. So, what is the effect? What has happened because of our backdrop? Here's the effect. It's that churches, and this is what I'm just observing, churches are forming into affinity groups and into affinity networks. I've watched this over several years. As a matter of fact, last year we had a group of leaders from various networks, affinity networks, who came to us and said to our organization, you've always focused on individual churches. You've focused on helping assimilate individual churches together into a larger network and servicing them. But would you be willing to consider providing services to networks? What do networks, what could they share? What resources do you have that multiple networks could utilize? And so instead of being a group or a network made up of churches, we became a network of churches and networks. And if you're over 65, you're baffled. And if you're your age, you're going, that's cool. And so it's this strange mix of churches and networks that have come together under one larger umbrella in order that they might be good stewards of things that God has provided for us in terms of resources in particular. So what do we see? The effect of churches coming together is that there is a sharing of information, all kinds of information. In our network, we share information about security issues. You know, if you're in our network and your church is working in Afghanistan, then you're receiving a constant update on what's going on in Afghanistan. You could receive information about of any type within a network like this, where there's constant forums and means of sharing information. We can share knowledge. It's been really interesting as we have. Every church in this network has made a commitment to focus on the formation of the congregation toward missional living. And so we developed a curriculum that is a shared curriculum online. So any church can go on and can access a shared curriculum and gain knowledge and implement the discussion of the implementation of that knowledge in a local church context. There's a sharing of resources. One church is ready to send. They've raised all the funding they can. They're short $15,000 this year. Another church has pitched in, and together we're sharing resources in order to help to send people to serve. There are all kinds of resources that are shared within this network. We share people. It's interesting how, as we spoke about corporate giftedness a few minutes ago, that there are individuals within your church that you could offer to the kingdom at large. It's great to keep them in your church, but when you offer that to that person to the kingdom at large, the multiplication and the explosion occurs, and so much more is accomplished by your willingness to give that person to the kingdom at large. There's a sharing of systems. We see churches sharing systems, all kinds of systems. It's been interesting in our network that there are multiple nonprofits that exist, and they have different focuses. Some of them are focused on ministries to children, orphan care. Some of them are relief-oriented. Some of them are purely church planting-oriented. And so there are all of these nonprofits that can be integrated or shared between the churches. If I were sending someone to work in a particular area that a nonprofit from another church was working in, I would probably utilize, rather than establishing something else myself, I would probably utilize the structures that were available to me through another church. We share identity. And I've realized this is an important thing for churches. In a time when we've gone through tremendous upheaval in terms of denominational identity, and I don't know about your church, but in mine, most of the young people in my church don't know the acronyms that we use. Oh, we're members of the SBC and the BGCT, and we give money to the IMB so that we can support the SC. Anyway, and what I've realized is that young adults come into my church, they don't know, and they really don't care. And we're kind of living in a post-denominational time where those kinds of identities don't matter. Yet at the same time, there's this longing for community of people and churches who have a similar perspective. And so identity is important. They're willing to come together with those with whom they have find energy, synergy, and a common identity. So what? So what does this demand for us as church leaders? As I said a few minutes ago, at the time that we began heading strongly in a direction toward equipping the local church for particularly for church-based sending, and begin to form networks that were drawn together by affinity or by shared services, shared resources. We were definitely swimming upstream. But what I realized was that we were not causing something to happen. That God was causing something to happen, and that we were adjusting our lives to the backdrop on our stage. That what we were experiencing was an effect of a greater cause. I remember bemoaning it one day. I was standing in the chapel at Dallas Baptist University and had been there for a presentation, and I was in one of those grumpy, bemoanish moods where I was going, this all just seems so disorganized and so chaotic. Whatever happened to the simple days when we wrote a check and we put it in the offering plate and somebody collected it, and somehow on the other end of that, what we got were some really cool pictures of people doing mission somewhere in the world. It was real glossy and clean. And somewhere there was a magic that occurred between my putting it in the offering plate and this picture that came back that didn't really bother me or affect my life. And I was bemoaning a little bit the fact that those days were forever gone and that everything seemed so incredibly chaotic. A friend of mine, a mentor, Dr. Bill O'Brien, happened to be there that day, and after the service, I began to share with him just my sense of unease about the confusion of the missional world, and he said, Cindy, Just because you don't understand it doesn't mean it can't be understood. Have you ever thought that perhaps God is positioning us and arranging us for what He's about to do? And I think it was at that moment that I had to release something and to say, what is God going to do through local churches and through this collective of local churches who come together in order to accomplish what God is calling them to do? And the truth of the matter is, it's like you can't go back. You can't go back to what used to be. As my husband says, I always say, well, the can of worms have been released, or the cat's out of the bag. And he said, no, the toothpaste has been squeezed out of the tube, and there is no way you're going to cram that back in there. We live in an era where the church is inverted. The church is released in the world through travel, through business, through globalization, through connectivity. That you think about the potential of connectivity and the fact that you could have a few people in the Middle East and North Africa who, because of their ideology, could stimulate a movement, a freedom movement across the Middle East and North Africa that shook the world in the last 2 years. Who were they? What were their names? In the same way, the church has the potential right now, because of the means that have been provided for us, to work together collectively and to be and to empower our people to affect the world in dramatic ways for Christ. So what? So what does this demand of you as a church leader? I'm going to give you 4 challenges as we close. Rather than being frustrated by what seems to be disorder and chaos, or the uncontrollability, the inability to count, if you are one of those people who needs to count, own, and label, instead of doing that, here would be my challenge to you. First of all, form the people of your local congregation, not only spiritually, but missionally. And it is different. Your spiritual formation is the seedbed out of which people arise to serve and to take the gospel to other places. But unless they've gone through some form of missional formation that is intentional, you as a leader, I as a leader, have fallen short of what God is asking us to do. Are there still professional missionaries? Yes. Praise God for it. But are the people in your congregation, do they possess the potential to be just as effective in the arenas where they are going on this globe? Yes. And it is our responsibility to make sure that they are missionally formed. Second of all, don't give your church an out. There are only 2 alternatives. Go or send. And if you're not going, if you're not called to go, then you are called to send. You are called to play a role in some way in seeing that sending occurs. Now, whether that's sending out of your local body, or whether that's sending a Chinese evangelist into another area, or an Afghani believer or a Pakistani believer into another area, somehow your church is to be involved in sending, going or sending. Thirdly, I would say this: think strategically. Don't just do stuff. Churches just do stuff. Oh, we do mission trips. Well, good. What does that mean? Don't just do stuff. Be intentional about what you do. Do it right. Be informed. Work with others. Collaborate together. Strategize together. And be effective in the way you invest your money, your people, your energy, and your time. Fourth word of advice from the mother here: collaborate. This drama is not about you. It's not about your church. It's about God and His glory. It's about the redemption of lost people. Jesus prayed for all believers that we would be one. In his prayers near the end of his life, just prior to the crucifixion, he prayed that we would be one and that we would be unified, that we would be united. Collaboration is the last frontier. And let me just tell you this: it's not easy. It sounds good. It's a pretty word. It's a catchword right now. It's not easy, because you know what collaboration requires of you? Sometimes it requires surrendering your own will, or surrendering the credit, surrendering some of the control, surrendering the ability to manage it. Sometimes collaboration is a huge sacrifice that demands a whole lot of communication and compromise. It is the last frontier, but through collaboration, we will find our greatest level of effectiveness as churches. I'm going to end with one just quick story to tell you that there was a church that partnered with the church. There were two Texas churches. One was a Metroplex church. The other was a small church from the opposite side of the denominational chasm, and it was in Lufkin, Texas. These two churches, though, had a common love. Had a common love for the Lord. They had a common love for an unreached people called the Fulani. And in spite of their differences theologically, they focused on that which they had in common. These two churches came together, and they sent a young couple to work among the Fulani with this perspective. This couple is not going to stay there forever. The role of this couple was to go in and to take the few believers they could gather from among the Fulani and somehow equip and inspire these indigenous believers that they were supposed to reach their own people. It's been a beautiful picture. In the last 2 years, we've seen an unbelievable unfolding and outpouring of the Spirit of God where staunch Fulani Muslims who claim to be the torch holders of Islam for West Africa, who were blinded by their worldview and their pulaku, their way of life. We've seen these Fulani come together, band together, and begin to reach their own people. You know, it's been one after another. Last month, they met together at a gathering, a Fulani believers gathering in a village outside of Niamey, Niger. There were about 80 or so believers that had walked to this particular gathering within one area. And it was a gathering that broke every rule. You had multiple castes meeting together. The leader was a slave class Fulani, leading and teaching Fulani chiefs, which among the Fulani is very much a caste system. Other organizations said this could never happen, but it did. We saw male and female meeting together under the same roof, studying the Bible together, studying the Word of God together. We saw Fulani and Gormanchi, two tribes, one an animist and one a strictly Muslim tribe, come together in one body and study the Word of God. Everything that mission agencies and others in this area had said couldn't happen was happening. Yesterday, I got a second call that said this week, 53 more responded to the gospel. That's because two churches, it's because of God, but it's because two churches responded to the call of God to unite their forces and work together to be obedient. My challenge to you would be this, that as you consider what God is asking you to do, consider the possibility that He's asking you to unite with other churches in order to accomplish greater things. Thank you.